hopefully you learn a bit from that and apply it onto your builds as well. Once you do, you'll get a much better finish, and they're really quite simple. Hello, this is BJ from Hearns Hobbies, and I'm going to go through a little tutorial just to give you an idea of how I go about building models. So mainly this is going to be focused on how I prepare parts coming off the sprue, and then into my gluing technique, and then filling and sanding. So let's just look at my work table here. So I've got a few things laid out. So I've got a selection of sprue which I've been using just for practice. I've got a few bits that I've already cut out. This is one that I've used before on another tutorial. I painted blue so it's a bit easier to see where it's been sanded. So I'll mainly be using this one as demonstration, because when I apply the putty, it's going to take a while for the putty to dry. So there's already some putty here which I applied before. So just give you a better idea of how I go to the next stage of sanding. All right, so I've got, these are the two halves that are identical to this. So basically I'll show you how I glue this one to get to this stage. Here's my glue I'm using here. This is a thin liquid cement from Tamiya. Got some Tamiya masking tape. I'll be using this to join these together during the gluing stage. Here's some putty. This is the Perfect plastic putty. It's a water-based putty. I've got my side cutters here. Got a couple of knives, one with a really fresh blade, one with a blunt blade, and then I've got some sanding pads, so various grits there as well. Okay, so let's go over here. So this is what a standard sprue is going to look like when you get it out of a kit. So obviously you've got your gates here, and we'll need to cut from these points to get the piece off. Now let's see if I can get up closer so you can see what I'm doing here. Get to focus. Just got to trick the camera. Here we go. Okay, so you can see here we've got the gates at these points, and I'll be using these side cutters to trim these. So there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can either cut all the way up to the part, so it's really flush, or you can cut a little bit far from the part with a little bit of a nub remaining. Now the preferable method is to cut a little bit further out, because if you cut directly flush now, there's a chance that you may crush the nub and it'll actually leave an indent in the joint. So let's just cut these, so probably like 1/2 mil or so, just so it's not totally flush. So you see how I'm cutting just away. So you see at this point, let's see if that's going to focus. There we go. So you see how I'm about probably 1/2 mil away from the actual edge of the actual part. Okay, so I'll cut it off like that. So from there. Oh, missed this one here. Okay, I'll put that aside. I'll move these across so you can get a better view. Okay, so that's how I've prepared the part to start with. Okay, you notice that there's obvious nubs still here. Okay, so the idea with this is I'll be cleaning these nubs off now. It depends on the part as well when you have a look. So this is obviously a top and a bottom section that makes up this control surface. Now if this side was totally flush, then I would have left these nubs, glued it all together, and then sanded them all off. That way both sides of this part would be totally flush. But because, if you can see from here, the nub actually protrudes through the bottom. So we'll need to trim that off first, and then the rest of it. Okay, so let's move on to the cleaning up part. Now since these nubs are quite big, I can use my side cutters to cut off most of that. Okay, so here I'll cut off flush because there's less of an issue of this leaving a indent, as opposed to the nub that's sitting on the outside. Okay, so that's those there. Okay, so that's reasonably flush now. Next step would be just to trim them off with a knife. Okay, so I've got my knife here. This is the one with the fresh blade. Okay, so I'm going to hold this firmly like this, and then you'll notice that I'm supporting the part with both hands. And then gently slice. Okay, by running this gently across the side like this, I'm using the side of the blade as a guide across this flat section. So what that's going to do is it's going to reduce the chances of it gouging, because we want it fairly flush, and it makes it quite smooth and easy. So this is a bit harder because there's less area to guide. You might be able to see that there's this square section here, so you just got to be a bit more careful as you're slicing that. And then there's one more here. Okay, so that's a basic procedure I'll go through. Now, that was just cutting it off the sprue. Now let's put this back, because I want to demonstrate with the parts that I've already got here. These will give you a better idea of when I actually put it together. All right, so this is at the stage where I've just cut it off the sprue. Okay, so you can see the big chunky nub marks are still on there. Okay, so here, here, and here. Now what I'm going to check is to see if they're flush. And they're flush, which means that if we push the two parts together, it's not going to obstruct it in any part of the joint. So you see that when I'm holding it together, it is pretty flush, and this side too. So if that's the case, I'm going to leave these nubs on and I'm going to clean them off after I glue it together. Okay, so what's going to happen is you've got these two nubs here. When you cut them off, there's less chances of gouging inside and leaving a gap. And I mean, the more you build, the more they'll come instinctively too, because no one likes to keep filling in gaps that you don't have to. Okay, so like so. Right, so you'll notice that naturally with large components, there's going to be some warpage involved. So you see here, there's this big gap that's created. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hold these components together in the area we want them with some tape, and then we're going to apply some glue between the tape to tack it together first. Okay, so that's where this masking tape comes in handy. Now you don't need a lot, so I'm just going to tear up small sections. Okay, so you see there are like small bits like this. And what you want to do is you find the area that's going to be, say, I guess the most visible. So seeing that this is going to be covered up with control surface, you concentrate on this leading edge. Because even though it's got locating pins, sometimes there's movement. So you want to get these as flush together as possible first. Make sure it's all aligned, and then we'll tape it in place. Okay, so you want to give it a slight tension, and then put it in place. So you notice that once I've done that, you've got this area here, which is coming out because of the length and also the slight warpage. Okay, so that's where we'll concentrate on this end. So you squeeze it all the way along, make sure it's flush. You can rub your fingernail across it and you feel the join. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing. Okay, so tension. Okay, so you won't be able to see any gap there anymore, and that's ready for glue. Okay, so we're going to do the same for the back end to keep it all together. Again, I'm going to get two pieces because it's a fairly long join. Okay, so we'll start with this end again. So I made sure that it's flush where we want it. Give it a bit of tension, pull it down flat, tape it down, and then concentrate on the other end. Okay, tension again. Okay, so when you have a quick look across this, all these sections are going to be held together. If it's a very wide section, you may need to put some tape across the middle there as well. This is okay, it's slightly bowing, but it's nothing that we can't hold together with a little bit of finger pressure as we go. Now on the end, that seems to be okay, and this end's all being held together as well. Okay, so let's apply some glue. So let's get our liquid cement. All right, so this is what Tamir called the extra thin. This is what I generally just call thin because it's like water. So there's quite a few different manufacturers that make it like this. You have the very fine brush. Okay, so to tack this, I'll apply directly across the join, and what will happen is the join will draw the glue in with capillary action. Okay, so that's right in the center there. And then I'll apply some on the end here. So that's the top end, and then also the far end. Now you're going to make sure that you don't get too close to the tape, because it's working on capillary action. If you're too close to the tape, it'll draw the glue into the surface of the tape, and then it'll mark the whole surface. Okay, so that's why we're doing it at spaced intervals away from the tape. And we'll do it the same on the opposing side. Okay, so we can get about here and here. So I'm probably around about 1 centimeter away from the tape. I mean, further away you are, the safer it's going to be, because all these points are going to do is just tack it together and hold it together so that it doesn't warp and pull apart on you. Okay, so they're the two long faces done. And then on the end, we'll do similar sort of thing. All right, so the thing is with the ends, we can pretty much glue the whole lot because it is all pretty flush. Okay, this end's just a little bit warped, so I'll just press it down a little bit. Quite often with these parts, once you apply the glue and it's seeped in, once you hold it just for a sec like that, it'll stay together. All right, so let's do this side. Okay, so that's tacked. So at this stage, because you're only connected to a few parts, if you suddenly notice that you've made a mistake somewhere or it's not properly aligned, you'll be able to break those joins because it's still semi-moist, and because it's not all the way down the seam, it won't make a huge mess. It'll be a little bit of a mess, which is still correctable, but at least at this stage you still will be able to crack it open if you need to. Okay, so I'm just going to give this a little bit of time so that it can actually hold. So you see here, this is the one I've done earlier. I started off with this one painted in blue so that as you clean it up, it's a lot easier to notice. Okay, so this is one I've done earlier. Got a bit of putty in there and it's already been scraped back. All right, let's just have a quick look. Because we don't have a lot of time, I would normally leave this a bit longer before I started working on it. Okay, so we'll take off the tape. The tape was just a guide to hold everything tensioned. Now once we take it all off, we'll have a close look at it again. So you see everything's flushed. This before was all splayed out. It's all held together. And once we're happy with that, we're going to get our glue again and we're going to apply it across the whole seam. Now this is going to give it its final strength. Okay, all the way along. So you might notice that I'm painting across the surface. This glue is so thin, you will see that it is on the surface because it will give a slightly gloss finish. But it won't mark it so much that you'll still see it under the paint. Because usually you'll be priming this as well before painting, and the primer will equalize all the surfaces and you won't be able to see it. Okay, so the end here is just picking up a little bit. Okay, so that's what it's going to look like after I've applied all the glue. Okay, looks like a solid piece. Still got the nub marks on it, okay, which I'm going to sand off. So this is probably a lot easier to understand why I've left the nub marks on it now. So I'm going to be using this whole face that's meant to be flush to act as a guide for the sanding blocks as well. There's less chances of taking off this interior part before it was joined, and it'll look more solid. So basically we're doing this thinking about how to make the build easier with less work in the long run. Okay, again, I would normally leave this longer so that the glue can set up, but I'm going to move straight into cutting off the nubs and cleaning off the nubs. Okay, so now I'm going to go flush. So I didn't go flush onto cutting these out while it was on the sprue, simply because when it's floating around the sprue, it can get snagged on things, and then you can tear it, and then you might hit it on the wrong angle. When it's off the sprue like this, you have a lot more control. Okay, so from here, we'll cut up flush with our side cutters. So you cut off the majority of it here. Okay, so that's all the nubs cut off with the side cutters. You might be able to see from certain angles here, there's still a slight nub remaining. Okay, you'll be able to feel the edge with your finger. Over here, you just feel them a little bit. Okay, so there's not a lot there. So we're going to either clean this up with a knife or with the sanding blocks. So I think I'll go with the knife to start with, because that will get rid of the bulk of it. So hold the knife like this, and you notice that I've got the blade across both sides. So that's acting like a guide, and there's less chances of gouging. Okay, so basically just a little bit of movement across there. So basically what we're doing is we're just shaving it down. Okay, trying to keep it perpendicular, because if you have too much angle, it'll just bite into the surface, and you'll get ugly cuts, which you'll have to clean up later. Okay, so that's all we're doing here. Let's clean up all the rest. And none down the front, and then there's one left here. Okay, that's the nubs finished. Okay, now what we want to do is there's still going to be a seam line where we glue these areas together. So to do that, we're going to scrape it and sand it. And if it's really off, then we're going to use putty as well. Okay, so that's where I'll use this one. Okay, so I've got the two knives here. Difference being is this one's got a blunt blade in it. Okay, so I generally use a blunt blade for scraping. If you use a fresh blade, it'll chatter across and it'll leave all these marks. With a blunt blade, it'll just take off the surface. Okay, so we're going to scrape like this. And what this is doing is it's equalizing the surface. And you'll see all this sort of fur coming off. So that's all the scraped plastic is coming off. Now if those nubs, so this nub is a little bit still protruding, I just trim that off a bit. Because if the nubs are still too pronounced, it'll be difficult to scrape. So what I'm trying to do here is just make that a level surface. And you'll find here that it's quite extreme. There's no way I'm going to be able to scrape that flat, simply because of how big the parts are. So it's going to need some putty at a later stage. Now if we do the leading edge here, we'll notice that once I do this, now that's flush. Okay, so with scraping, you want to limit the amount of scraping, because scraping can actually take off a lot of material, as you can see with the fur here. So this one, it's needed because there's a lot of material you want to remove. Here you do it gently, so you can take off that main lip. And then on these areas here, these parts are going to have an extension put on them. So basically it doesn't have to be super clean, but you need it to be clean enough so that it doesn't obstruct the next part going on. Okay, like so. And then this is going to go in the fuselage. So you want to make sure this is flat so that it's going to look flush with the fuselage. All right, so there's a bit of nub there. Okay. All right, so that's all the scraping I'm going to be doing. All right, let's just brush off some of this fur from here. Okay, so with the scraping that I've done here, it's probably easier to see on this one. Okay, so I painted it blue so that as we scraped, you'll be able to see the differences with raw plastic coming up. So you'll be able to see here, this is that line of grey. So that's where it's been scraped. And you'll see there's probably a thin line of blue down the very center, and that's the actual seam line where it's joined. And it's very fine, which means we've done a pretty good job with the gluing there. All right. On the opposite side, you notice here, scraping here, there's still quite heavy blue down the center. And that means there's quite a bit of sinking, and we want that flush. So I've already started to apply some putty across here. Okay, so let me show you how I apply the putty. So that's putty that's already dried, so I'll be using that for sanding later. I'll show you on this one here. All right, so we've got the same sort of edge here. I'll get my knife blade. Okay, so just for demonstration's sake of using this blunt blade again. There's no need to use a really fresh blade for applying putty. I'm going to be using this like a spatula. Okay, so I've got putty here. Now I quite like this putty because it's water-based. Being water-based, it doesn't have a strong smell to it. Just squeeze a bit more out. Make sure you cap it up because these putties do set off pretty quick and they dry up. Okay, so you see that it's just on the blade there. And basically we're just going to scrape it into the joint here, press it down, and you're basically just smearing it across while putting a bit of downward pressure. Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a laborious exercise, but that's the basic technique for applying. Okay, this is also the same way you apply a lacquer-based or oil-based putty as well. And this one's not sticking too well because I think I've had this sitting around for a bit too long. So let me just have a look here and get some fresh putty out. Because sometimes on the ends here, it does get a bit dry. So let's have a look here. Right, so that's looking a bit fresher. It should be coming out like toothpaste. So let me just clean this off. All right, let's give that another go. Okay, so just apply it here. So just scrape it along the seam. Like so. So sometimes you have to apply it quite heavily because I may not want to bond initially, and then you're going to be sanding it down smooth anyway. All right, so you see how I've just got those angles in there, just smearing it across here to fill in that center gap. Okay, so that is going to look like this once it's been applied. Okay, now this is going to take another hour or so before it hardens up, so hence why using this one. Okay, so that's how you apply it. So we'll be applying it all the way down this seam, and then across the front as well if there's big gaps, but since there isn't, there's no need to do that. And with this one, I've just done halfway, so I'll give you a good idea anyway. This way, over here you can see here where it's just scraped. This is where I've applied the putty. Okay, so from this point here, we're going to clean this up. It's easier to sand it with some blocks. So I've got a couple of blocks here. This particular one's got 240 or 400 grit. My general go-to is 400 grit. It can take off quite a bit of material, so it's speedy build, but it's not so coarse that it's going to leave really rough marks. Okay, so use a little bit of pressure, and we'll just sand all the way along here. And you notice that these are quite long too, and if you need it to be really flat, you can use it like this. The trick is when you're sanding, not to force it to round like this, because if you use this sort of motion, it's going to round off this corner. So you try to do it as straight motion as possible. And just keep an eye on your part here. So you'll be able to see the grey coming through. So the grey is the raw plastic. The white's the putty. So basically you want to get it to a point where it's totally smooth. And there's no jagged parts. Okay, so that's feeling pretty smooth. Now what we'll do now is we'll check the edges. Okay, so the edges have got a little bit of overflow from the putty, so we'll clean those off. So quite often with these water-based ones, you can use your fingernail to get the bulk of it off. The advantage of that is you're going to reduce the amount you're going to be sanding. If you sand too much, you'll take off all the surface detail. Okay, so that's pretty good. All right, so what I'm going to do is, so I started with the 400. That was pretty smooth here. I'm going to move on to something smoother, and that's going to be the 600. Okay, so 600 here. So just smooth it off. The 600 will get it down to almost a similar sort of finish to the original plastic. Just going to lightly drag that across the top as well to get rid of that excess putty. Okay, and that's it. Now with this side here, which was scraped down, you can also go over that with the fine sanding. Gentle motions. Because this is a curved surface, you don't want to just stick in the one spot, otherwise you get a flat spot, and that would be quite ugly for a leading edge. Okay, so that's it there. Okay, so this leading edge is prepped, that's ready for priming and painting. This back area, that's pretty smooth, that's ready for priming as well. What you find is if you do this and you find little gaps like here, this is the time when you apply some more putty and then go through the steps over again. And you'll keep doing it until you get it to fine and smooth finish that you're happy with. And then you move on to the puttying, onto the priming, and then onto the painting. So that's it. This is my very quick how to prep parts off the sprue, cleaning off the nubs, scraping, gluing, well, actually it should be gluing, then scraping, and then putty application, and then sanding, ready for painting. So this is a technique I'll be using for any model kit. I've highlighted this for large areas on an aircraft, but even smaller areas on a military vehicle or on a car, for instance. So there you go. So that's the basic techniques I'll be using. Hopefully you learn a bit from that and apply it onto your builds as well. And once you do, you'll get a much better finish. And they're really quite simple. So thank you for watching, and see you soon.